Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
We are back here recording on Wednesday, March 11th, and
311.
um,
Oh, no.
that's the date. No,
For
oh,
real.
I don't know. Yeah, March 11th.
That was Fukushima Day.
Oh, that's right. I was
Yeah.
thinking there was an anniversary. It turns out it was the Fukushima anniversary. That's
Ninth
right.
anniversary, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. Um, very. Yeah. Speaking of things that we have a current, you know, possible major global health pandemic going on, and speaking of things that happened almost a decade ago, we still don't know the full consequences of what did and did not happen at Fukushima, much less the current disease. So thanks for bringing that up. I mean, it kind of serves as like it serves as an example of we have this current health crisis going on, and we don't even still know the effects of something that happened 9 years ago on this date. So
Wow, that's a good point, Greg.
anyhow, I guess we should. This has been something that I've been very careful in approaching or not approaching as far as this coronavirus, and obviously is the major news going on in the world right now. I mean, it is the focus of so much attention, and rightly so. But with me, it's been a issue of not wanting to get tangled down in the weeds regarding it. There's a lot of noise out there, both in the mainstream media and the so-called alternative media, regarding what this is not, how much people should worry. I don't want to get into all of that, but I definitely see some very serious matter globally. It's really, really hit Europe hard right now. You sent me a thread from Italy of a Twitter thread from Italy, just the seriousness of the situation in Italy, and increasingly it is now starting to reach the U.S. in various areas. I believe Washington State has been hit. There's a one mile area in New York, within the vicinity of New York City, that is currently under that is, I believe would you call it a lockdown, or?
Yeah, maybe like a New Rochelle, I think is the
Yes, New
area.
Rochelle. It's an
About like
area
a
in the New
mile
York.
squared is
Yeah.
under lockdown, but with the help of the National Guard, I think is what's going on.
So this is getting serious, regardless of what, the theories that are out there about it, and how much how much directly individuals should fear and worry about it. But it is getting serious and does need to be addressed, I believe, in some capacity. I believe we have a responsibility as much as anybody else is to at least address and bring a perspective out about it. So, Jeremy, I'm going to give you the floor for a few minutes to talk about some of the. We can have a discussion about some of the things you've noticed about this, where some of your concerns are, and where you believe focus can and should be placed on, and then we could just have a discussion about this for a while before moving on to other topics.
Okay, that sounds good and appropriate. And I guess we may live in interesting times, as the Chinese expression slash curse goes, and there's an aspect around biology, whether or not it's manufactured biology, synthetic biology, or natural biology, that has a tendency to overwhelm our belief systems at some level, and the questions of life and death and the safety and security of our family and friends and our elders and the youngers and all of that. And so I have noticed that it looks like that the ability to grapple with the actuality and the reality of this virus situation, the global pandemic, whatever it's labeled, whether SARS-CoV-2, which is the name, I believe, of the virus, and sort of like as a next generation SARS, that looks like it's not as deadly, but much more communicative, and with a lot of different factors that make it more of an actual threat to create a very difficult global pandemic, or COVID-19, which I believe is the name of the disease, the way it's been named globally. Uh, so there's an aspect of the reality of biology and biological realities and their safety and security in relationship to that have a tendency to sharpen the mind when it's actually grappling with the reality. And these overlays of questions like politics and economics they're so crucial, and that's the thing. They're really important. It's like language. Like what is our human reality and even our biological and survival reality without language? It's sort of, it's pretty crucial to our who we are and how we work in the world and survive in the world. And so similarly, it's understandable the way that things like economics and politics and those kind of frameworks could actually at some level be overemphasized at some level in terms of understanding, whether it's structural or institutional understanding or individual personal ideological understanding of the actual potential threat of a global pandemic, a virus making its way through the populations, crossing national borders, and all of that. And so I have noticed that certain groupings of people who maybe put emphasis on politics and economics as sort of like the core layers of the human reality have had a tendency to try to maybe avoid the reality of this thing via whatever kind of analysis there is. And I would just then point out that because of the crucial nature of things like economics and politics, I would say too, as I pointed out in relationship to how crucial things like language are to the human reality, that there's an aspect of how we respond to this, both as individuals and individual families and communities, and as societies and countries and nations and the world and those kinds of scales of being, that there's going to have to be a balancing, or I would say more of like a synergistic attention to both the question of economics, remember coming from the Greek oikos, how you make your home, and this question of the threat of the spread of the virus and the pandemic, and those and the biology and the question of how to mitigate, remediate against the kind of threat of the spread of the virus, that are difficult things. And as we saw in China, and Greg, we sort of, our understanding of this has been evolving over the last month and a half to some large extent, and it was already on our radar when we went up to Iowa in late January. And
Yeah.
and I remember being a little freaked out just going into the Trump rally, not just because of the social dynamics and the politics, which we've already discussed all of that, and people can go see the video of when we got escorted out at the end, trying to educate Major Garrett of CBS about Epstein being Israeli military intelligence. But I remember just being, having a sense of this is a global this looks like what we're seeing in China, what we had already seen at that point for about a week, I think,
Mhm.
where Wuhan had been locked down for a week, I believe, by the time we went to Iowa, that I had this sort of, this uneasy sense of us in this big crowd of people. And so,
Well, that might have been warranted, the Trump rally, considering some of the more recent developments within Donald Trump and in Trump's own inner circle, including the man who he currently is replaced Mick Mulvaney with as the current chief of staff, Congressman Mark Meadows, is, I believe, among several GOP members of Congress, is under self quarantine right now, and he, among others, has been with Trump very recently. Also, Matt Gaetz was with Trump on Air Force One not long after having possibly come into contact with the virus at CPAC, and then self quarantining himself as well. So, with some of that, and even Sanders and Biden campaigns or canceled events that were supposed to be in Ohio last night, but Trump at this point is still considering, at least at this point in time, is still going ahead with his planned big Milwaukee rally, I believe, next week. So, considering your feeling about that at the time, and I think it was a little more on your radar than it was mine at that point in time, although I think we were both, there was a concern there, but I think you had kind of early on had picked up on the possible really strong feelings about it earlier than I had. But even at that time, I mean, you had this feeling about being in a big crowd. It just happened to be a Trump rally, and we're seeing all this stuff now with people surrounding Trump and possible exposure to it. It's pretty wild.
It is wild. That is wild. And, and there's an aspect of this where we don't really quite yet know the origins. And by that, I mean not only the question of the origins of whether it was a naturally evolved virus or whether it was a manufactured synthetic, something like more like a bioweapon. And that is an important question. But I do want to put that aside just for the moment here because it could be that our response to it might be related to its origins. But I then want to deal directly with this question of its temporal origins and whether, because there's the common storyline, of course, is that this was had just sort of started really getting going in January in China, and then it really started making its way, to the United States and around the world, and into February and now into March. But it's very, very possible. I mean, that this virus was already circulating months and months and months before, and there are some indicators within Chinese news sources that this had been on certain people and doctors' radar screens months earlier, and that we do know for sure that the Chinese ruling Communist Party had, in the very early days of the beginning of the mass awareness of the presence of this virus, was very suppressive, was suppressing those who were trying to talk about it. So, with that background, we must consider the possibility that this virus was circulating not only in China, but also potentially into other parts of the world much, much earlier. And so, in a certain way, thinking back on it, I don't believe that my sort of unease at a deep biological level of being in a crowd at that time was completely misplaced, even looking back on it in terms of the reality of our situation. And the thing is, with like things like the pandemics or epidemics, that a lot of things are about the timing of your response, the precision of your response, and the layers of your response to it. And what we see, of course, is that in China, the government went from trying to suppress the knowledge of it, it looks like, to being like, holy smokes, this thing is getting crazy, and doing a massive, multi-million person citywide lockdown response like nothing we've ever seen in the modern world, really. I can't recall anything that I'm familiar with of that level of the rapidity of action at a national scale like that, in terms of especially in terms of a response to a disease, and then that combined, the lockdown combined with the shutting down of their factories and the economy, and then their quick building of these sort of triage style additions to their medical facilities that we saw, where they're trying to put up what were called hospitals in just a week or two or something like that. This all indicates and indicated that this is something very, very serious, way beyond some China and Italy trying to pwn or own the Trump people in the United States, and that this is just a deep state Democrat fraud on the keeping America great.
Well, that's another example of like the focus on economics, and as you were talking about before, I mean that just seems to be almost, if you were to pay attention to like the Trump sphere, it's all that seems to be the focus is. Trump is all about his initial response, at least. I'm not sure how much it's evolved. But initial response was all about the economy, and that was the talking point coming from some of the pro-Trump media, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh types, that it's a deep, this is the deep state's creating a hysteria about this to hurt Trump and to hurt the economy, so that they'll make him look bad going into the election. So I mean, that's a great example of that. But as you've said, and then maybe I don't want to get you too off the track of thought from what you were saying just now, but you mentioned that before with people who are just focused on the economic and political aspects of it, and how it causes people to take their eyes off the ball of other things. And I'm sure it's had that effect with a good number of pro-Trump people who get their information and news, rely on these sources for their information on how to respond to things and how to think about things.
Yes, and at the same time, maybe we should just move a little bit into the actual Trump response because it's indicative and illustrative of the actual dynamics of what is actually going on here. And then maybe we could then move into what my sense of like what rational and wise responses might be, both from an individual, familial, community level, but then on up to the questions that are going to increasingly be asked in a insistent, almost survival or existential, weighty manner at things like the state and national and international level. And because it could be that this, depending on how this all progresses, regresses, this could be a sort of before and after style event of some sort in relationship to the human epoch of some sort. And at the very least, it looks like it's potentially heading towards something like an early 1900s Spanish flu style, significant, once in 50, once in 100 year kind of pandemic that humanity is facing. But this may be because of the economic implications and how the globalization of the economy, that this is, and the timing of this in relationship to the pumped up American economy, which are obviously, there is a piece of the Trump, as I've called it, the Trump pump and dump op, that is only exacerbated or exaggerated the pumped up aspect of the American economy. But that was through and through over decades and decades, obviously went on under Obama. Obama decided to not root out the criminal bankers and decided to sort of patch things together and re-stand the sort of globalized economy back up on its feet. And so that's something that we should not avoid, that there's an existential aspect to economics, obviously, and we are very quickly confronting this. And many people have not yet quite grasped what the full impact of a contemporary United States. Go look at how everybody knows this, of course, how much of basically everything is manufactured in China. Okay. But it's not just cheap, uh, consumer items, where we sort of basically decided to trade, the ability to manufacture maybe higher quality stuff here at home for cheaper, accessible manufactured goods from China. But it's also things like pharmaceuticals and for example, India put out a national scale order about how all raw materials, I believe, because India is actually a key producer of certain pharmaceuticals and vitamins and nutraceuticals, and especially for the unlabeled or the more affordable market in the United States. And India put out a national scale halt, or at least a check on running through every single potential sale of those kinds of materials before it was exported. So that it looks like India is preparing for needing that material for their own people, and then China as the factory of the world. These kinds of this situation that our so-called leaders helped perpetrate for many, many decades, and that we, the people, allowed and to be done in our name. And to be blunt about it, we decided to sort of take the convenient and easy route to accept it because we could have access to cheaper goods at some level. And so these are the kind of questions that are going to be coming up while we are dealing with the direct biological threat of this virus. And so I just maybe let's quickly assess what the Trump response is, because it is very indicative. And then he talks about the economy, and you remember James Carville, right? And Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, right?
It's the economy, stupid.
And James Carville
I can't do that Cajun accent, but yes, it's the
economy,
economy.
stupid. It's yeah.
And his wife, who was a Cheney staffer, Mary Madeline. Anyway.
Yeah, so they obviously hold deep principles. Okay, so So yeah, so and it partially, it's, I would say it is the economy, meaning like actually the survivability of people in their own family, in their own personal situations. Obviously, that's the key issue politically. That's always going to happen. You know, people should have a self interest. Preferably, we'd have an enlightened self interest, and so Trump's spoken to that to some extent. But what he really has done, obviously, it's not really the economy. It's a sort of top heavy, high level Wall Streety sort of segments of his oligarchical industrialist backer kind of economy, and that's exactly apparently what's going on. Is that his one of his buddies in the sort of shale industry or something like that is has put some pressure, and they're gonna offer a bailout to the shale industry or some stupid stuff like that. They're gonna offer a bailout to the cruise ships, right? Okay, and then they're gonna do some tax cuts at the paycheck level, right? Uh, and so, but the thing is that if you go look at it, go look at the West Coast ports. They are heavily shut down, and you know, once you start losing jobs like the longshoremen or the truckers, or you know, that's very very structural kind of jobs. And so if people don't have a job, they don't care about whether they had a tax cut in their, you know, from payroll.
It's an interesting point you bring up with these loss of jobs because you think about even with even in the weeks and months to come, if people start to self quarantine themselves more and or mass events get shut down, people start to more and more just stay inside to avoid being out for things. I mean, that's going to cause a massive hit to all kinds of industries, and you could see a lot of job losses in all kinds of different areas of industry. I mean, that will have a major effect on you know our on our economy as we know it, and the livelihood and um, the the quality of people's lives. I mean, there's all kinds of major consequences that need to be taken into consideration, but at the same time, you have to try to keep a realistic mindset as much as possible and not try to get too too, I guess, overly concerned to the point where it is a negative. But I mean, these considerations do need to be definitely pushed. And I think there's also a fine line between like this obsession over the economy and also like the way that I think some, Trump and some of his people are using this in some ways. And also there's people on, the other side, so to speak, that are the same way. But, being mindful of not getting like too obsessed with just the economic consequence of this, but also the fact that there are some very real, in terms of jobs and industry, you could see some very real effects of this, even in just like service style industries. People not choosing not to go out to eat, people choosing not to go to events. I mean, this could have some big effects in the weeks and months to come, depending on how long this goes. And so, it's just
Yes,
something to think about.
I completely agree. And there's a psychological preparation component to aspects of that, beyond just the sort of the physical and the biological, like what you can do to prepare your own body, such as things like vitamin C, zinc, vitamin D. Luckily, we're heading in the northern climates into spring and summer where there's more sun. The interaction with skin with the sun is where how you produce the core of your vitamin D and zinc. You know, I mean, these kinds of things. But there's another aspect of this where it's preparing psychologically to handle the disruption that is already here to some extent in terms of everything that's being canceled, and more is going to be canceled in the future. And you're right, Greg, like in terms of the disruption to aspects of the service economy everywhere from the restaurant on up to conferences, even like they, you know, things like that are very likely wise decisions, such as shutting down South by Southwest in Austin this year, is a major hit
Yeah.
to the service
Um,
economy. Certain the stories out of Austin is that certain, you know, people in the service economy like save up a large portion of, you know, major aspects of their finances from that single event every single year.
and And I think, honestly, these things, we talk about like South by Southwest cancellations like that are ultimately not, they're ultimately rather unimportant details in a much bigger, much more important narrative. But I mean, they are influential and they affect the way, people. It affect the way our society functions and operates, and the way people live their lives. I mean, Coachella is a big convention, big conference. It's being postponed at the very least. There's talk of NCAA basketball games, March Madness being played in front of no crowds. You can only imagine how this is going to get when it gets to be baseball season and a number. And so there's there's all kinds of. We don't know what the responses are going to be because we don't know how bad things will or will not get. But I mean, it's going to be things that we have not seen before in this age in our society, and it's setting up for. This is good. 2020 is going to be very different for a lot of reasons, and these are just, while they're not on the grand scheme of things all that important, they are significant in that they are going to affect the way people live and the way things operate from an economic perspective to a social perspective. And I think and it could very well have major political effects obviously with an election coming up. And I mean, worst case scenario, I mean, you get to November and it's still bad. Who knows what the election scenarios are going to be? But it's just thinking about it in real time now. It's changing. It's going to change this way we live in a lot of different ways. And I think people can and cannot foresee in ways that people can see and can predict, in ways that people cannot foresee and predict.
I think you're completely right. And so maybe that is an opening to then refocus on because it's part of an aspect of this is how the quote unquote elite or the ruling class or our leaders, however we want to call them, there's a certain reckoning, especially in the United States, I would say, that and by the way, I just got a text from my wife that says global pandemic declared, even though it was already on. So this is thinking back now, just sort of like to the quaint early days of like January, when it was only about the threat of World War III and the assassination of a high level Iranian general, and little quaint things like that. And so yeah, the year is definitely getting. We're not even done with the first quarter, and the world's a little bit more interesting than many probably would have hoped for.
Oh
But
yeah.
meanwhile, life goes on, and so in the midst of this, there is a stark vision of how inept at some level and how morally depraved at another level the sort of the an entire layer, I would say, of our so-called leadership, ruling quote unquote elite, all of that is, whether it's in relationship to the nature of our healthcare system. And I would also point out that a similar kind of critique that I would have for like Trump, it's different because I believe that like Bernie Sanders represents at the very least more of an actual real populist, and that I don't believe that he's not there to serve the sort of ruling elite groups that I believe Trump actually is. At the same time, Bernie Sanders' quote unquote critique of the healthcare system is almost totally financialized, and it's almost all about economics, and it's so small minded, and it's not really defensive of the actual bodily health and wellness of the American people. And so it's all just about you got to guarantee health insurance. What about not being forced to eat and breathe and drink weaponized substances? What about the American people having been like subject to like the waste of all of these industries being sold to us as foods for a long, long time? What about us being like such high levels of cancer and all of this? And this is coming into stunning focus in a way that someone like Bernie Sanders, who's sort of too, crude socialist, if I were to say it like that, too crude in terms of his economic thinking, to be able to actually address the heaviness of the situation that's facing with the American people, that we are, because of the way that the nature of this virus, that it at the very least in this bloom, and this is important to understand too, if you go back to the Spanish flu of 1918, these kinds of pandemics go in blooms, right? So, and you heard Trump saying, don't worry, one day it'll just go away like magic. It'll just one day it'll be gone, and just waving his hands around, doing cues, whatever thing he's doing with his hands, it's just going to be gone one day. And there might be some truth to that aspect in terms of that there are pulses in this. Definitely some of it relates to maybe not that the virus is necessarily killed in relationship to heat coming on in the northern climates, but there might be that aspect. But at the very least, the vitamin D levels going up in people, there becomes a pulse downwards. But then in the Spanish flu of 1918, there was actually the second pulse was actually worse for children, I believe. That the first one was worse for the elders, and then the second one was worse for children. And whether that was, I believe, is probably a next generation or a mutation uh, of the virus. And so that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to prepare for here after we believe we've sort of learned the parameters of this specific virus that's going to be attacking our elders, our friends and family members who are elders who have weakened immune systems for whatever reason. And I guess my earlier point was because of this long-term assault on the bodies of the American people. And I'm just, I'm being a little bit too chauvinist in terms of my perspective, but this is where I live, this is where I grew up, this is what I know. So at some level I'm trying to be humble in terms of speaking to what I really, really know. Meanwhile, other parts of the world are going to face their own situations, as we're seeing in China or in Italy, or in potentially more rational responses or early responses or wise responses, as we've seen maybe in places like South Korea or even in Singapore. But the United States, we're really facing a serious situation here because of the perfect storm of factors. One of those being the decades long assault on the bodies of the American people in terms of the mass cancer that we're facing, in terms of these depleted immune systems that a lot of people have because of the junk that we're sold continually, and it's called food, and our children are sold this, things that basically cause inflammation and disease in the body, and that's called food. And so we have a serious situation. So when you combine that with a lack to to access to replete what's called healthcare, which is really just medical facilities or health insurance. And when you go look at the list of the accessibility to the amounts of bed per 1,000 people in a population, the United States and England are pretty far down there. And places like South Korea and Singapore are way further up there. And so the combination of the lack of a wise or an early response by our so-called leadership, with the actual situation that we've allowed to build up in our country, both in terms of our illness, our dis-ease, and the a medical system that's more and more been eviscerated and has been financialized to serve the people who have access largely in a good way, but like the actual working people of the United States of America are in really a difficult position in relationship to this, whether it's like the idea of being able to quarantine yourself. It's nice, being in, a digital workers, in Silicon Valley, those companies are beginning to have people stay home. But even in the IT sector, not every, people actually have to work with the hardware, and that the digital economy is based on hardware that someone has to manage, and so that's a deal. And then of course, like the service sector and people who have to go out in order to do their work in the world. Okay, so we're facing a very serious situation in this country. And I would point out that it's not only medical, that the economic aspect of this, in terms of being so highly dependent on China for manufacturing, from anywhere from the pharmaceuticals to the basic sort of daily goods of some sort, or our consumer items, to things like phones, iPhones, that kind of thing. That this is going to be much more serious than even we know now. And because China is allegedly sort of now getting back up and going back to work to some extent, I would direct people to the Twitter account of someone named Cliff High, who's a very interesting. It's not that I agree with all of his assessments of everything, but he is very, very interesting in terms of his perspective, and what he was predicting what was going to happen was that China was going to do these, very severe responses of locking down cities and severe
Mhm.
medical surveillance, and things were going to get better, and they were going to go back to work, and then that's when the serious stuff would happen.
Can you spell out his name and his give his Twitter handle,
Yeah,
people?
I think it's a Cliff. That's Clif, and then High. Look him up on Twitter. If you go look for the hashtag Shaga Gangster, you'll now find Cliff High, and I think that a lot of his preventative prescriptions, and even potentially, like, even in more difficult circumstances, if people's families and friends get into difficult situations in terms of this virus and can't, and the healthcare system has become overwhelmed by that point, he even has ideas about how, like, worst case scenario treatments, where you do additional work with certain formulations, herbs, but basically vitamin C and shaga at certain low levels as a preventative. And I'll just give you an example of, like, what my son and I developed. It's basically, everybody's seen Emergency. I think you can go get it at Walmart. Those little packets. That sort of acts as your foundation, and then if you can, you get like a couple lemons, fresh lemons, squeeze those, do the emergency packet, and then, some kind of a little whatever sweetener that you might prefer. Fill it up with water, shake it up, shake it up, shake it up. And children can drink like a little bit of it, and adults can drink more, and that's way that people can get their vitamin C levels up, so we don't have time to go into all of that, but maybe we can discuss things more as we go forward. But moving back into the politics of all of this, and the way that I think that people like Trump are going to be exposed. They're already been
Go
exposed
lay down.
in relationship to the way that they are either responding or not responding to this. And the moral emptiness of someone like Donald Trump was so obvious when he began to talk about that his number, I know my numbers, he didn't want to release the
Yeah.
people from the boat. Imagine what it was like to be trapped on the boat. It wasn't your fault, like, it's sort of this
Yeah,
stuff
and he
started
said something
happening.
about it not being their fault, meaning it's not the administration's fault or it's not his fault.
Right, right. It's right. And so he was like, "Oh, I don't want to release them, so my numbers don't go up." But meanwhile, the numbers are going to go up. The numbers are going up, and
Yeah.
and they haven't been testing.
Numbers are going up, and people possibly, and people even around him and around people important to his administration
Talk
and within
about
his
that,
inner
Greg. Go,
circle.
go into the background of the CPAC, and who might have been exposed there. And
Yeah.
there's also
Oh,
an APAC aspect to this too.
yes, which is very interesting. There were people at the APAC conference, which I believe I heard up to two-thirds of the U.S. Congress attended the APAC meeting. I might be wrong on that, but a good percentage, somewhere in that area of members of elected officials in the U.S. Congress attended the APAC conference, and there was a conference goer at APAC who had been, you know, at the very least, had been there's a possibility that this person had actually had the virus and was communicating with people, shaking hands with people. And then also we mentioned earlier, we mentioned Congressman Mark Meadows, who is now Trump's new chief of staff, replacing Mick Mulvaney. He has put himself on self quarantine after after spending time with the president, among other people. I would guess Meadows was at CPAC, and then also at CPAC was Congressman Matt Gaetz, who Representative Matt Gaetz was at CPAC, and then he is now also in quarantine days after he made a big show of wearing a gas mask to sign a spending bill. And that, I mean, Gates claims he wasn't making light of the situation. Other people claim he was. I would guess the truth's probably, somewhere in the middle. Although it wouldn't surprise me, considering the GOP like establishment, punditry, pundit reaction to this virus. That it's all just being done to hurt Trump, and liberals are getting people all hysterical and worried. It wouldn't surprise me if it was some type of show on Matt Gates's part. But anyway, Gates is under quarantine. Even Senator Ted Cruz is under self quarantine, and he he was most and so it's it's very interesting that it comes out of these groups. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, the fact that it was, it was APAC, and I believe there was even was it a Habat dinner connection to this CPAC attendee?
Yeah,
It's
Shabbat,
very,
right? The Shabbat dinner to CPAC. That's what what's Rahan Salam I think was saying that
yes,
that
Rahan Salam is the British former head of Breitbart London, very close to Steve Bannon and Nigel Farage.
And then I believe that it has been identified that the what they're calling the ground zero, the ground zero patient of CPAC APAC was a man named Dr. Alan Berger who was involved in both places, and so that may be who that they are referring to. But it is pretty. I mean the silliness or the absurdity or the self importance at some level of some of the leadership all the way on up is becoming very, very obvious. Where
Just
it's
imagine if this was people in Bernie Sanders' inner circle, how these same people would be reacting.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. Like the Mulvaney, the videos of Mulvaney at CPAC, and he's like coughing right into his right hand, and then the clips it goes right to him shaking hand with the head of the CPAC convention, and there's Trump saying, maybe it would be really good to, people won't shake hands, and you go back to the whole Katie Johnson allegations, and
Yes.
people only give. Mr. Trump hand jobs with the glove on, and you would think that someone like that, if that's the case, if that's true, and he's always said he's a germaphobe and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
Trump is. It shows he has this internal division, just like the tension between the economy and the biological security. That's the tension in terms of national responses to the COVID-19. That Trump himself, his desire to seek the adulation, both in terms of going to
Yes.
his fans and shaking their hands, because you
Hmm.
saw the video of that right after a few days after he said, maybe people should shake hands less, and yet there he is shaking the hands of his adoring fans or
Yeah.
seeking the mass adulation of his rallies, as we spoke to in terms of
Yes.
some of our recordings around our experience of it. And there's a tension between that and him as a germaphobe.
Yeah, and great points. And Jeremy, I appreciate you bringing a bigger perspective to this, looking beyond just simply the issue of even like something like this corona as it relates to even healthcare, and moving it into bringing in bigger topics other than people. It's just not enough for people to only be concerned about this stuff when there's a possibility of a mass pandemic, or even in a narrow conversation of something like the healthcare system. When I think maybe we should move towards a conversation when we consider these things. Everybody wants to make it about economics, and the right wing wants to make it about a welfare state and socialism doesn't work and all this and that stuff. I mean, taking all that aside, maybe we should turn into a conversation about what exactly people are and are not taking into their bodies, what all these things that everybody wants to talk about from an economic perspective. I mean, what is going to change about the bigger perspectives of how people eat, how people shop, what they put in their bodies. And so I'm glad you bring a bigger perspective into this. I think this makes for a greater basis for a possible longer conversation about that sometime in the hope maybe in the future. So I'm once again bringing in the radical middle, as you call it. I think bigger picture perspective on a lot of this stuff. So I really appreciate that. And I think a lot of people out there appreciate that as well. Do you have any final thoughts on coronavirus before we move on to a couple of final topics in the last 15 or so minutes we have?
Well, I just appreciate you saying that, and I think it's become inescapable that certain things that we take for granted in terms of the way that we've set up our politics and our economics and our healthcare is changing, no matter whether we want to or not. And so then it's a question of, all right, this whole layer of so-called leadership that sort of got set us up in many ways for this situation to be worse than it needed to be, that they're going to be replaced. But the question is what is the new strain of leadership, and how pervasive are we going to make it, and how deep is it going to be rooted in the best of our American and human traditions? So these are questions that are just starting to come to the surface and are become inevitable to face at some level while in the midst of all of this. And I'll just say that that there are a lot of layers to consider of all of this, both in terms of politics and national considerations, all the way down to us as individuals and as people who have family and friends that we love and want to protect. And so, we'll begin talking about that some more as we move forward.
Okay, thank you for that. And so, here in our last 15 minutes, I want to shift over to we talked about the politics of the coronavirus. Well, it might be a good time to talk for a few minutes about the politics of the current, Democratic Party primaries. And I got to say, by the way, I think we were both completely wrong last summer when we made our prognostications for the how this Democratic primary would turn out. We certainly did not expect it. We thought Joe Biden was done when Kamala Harris was going after him real hard over his civil rights record. We thought he was going the way of Jeb Bush, but now, inexplicably, we've got a man who seems to be bordering on I don't know if it's a dementia or a senility or what it is, poised to become the Democratic nominee for president. Just yesterday, he was threatening someone, he was threatening I believe, was it an auto worker in Michigan with you know, bringing an AR-14, of course, another slip of the tongue from Biden, one of many. It's talk of AR-14s and threats to beat someone up. I mean, it's ridiculous, absurd. It truly is a theater of the absurd. But I never expected at this point Joe Biden would be in the prime position. And once again, I mean, Bernie once again. It's I don't know what shenanigans we saw in Iowa. The shenanigans that have been going on at the as far as the vote and all that with the caucus and that app that was brought out, Shadow Inc. And we did an in-depth program about that at the time. But this time, it seems that the Democrat establishment has rallied around this Joe Biden. It seems to have really taken a bite and really affected how people have reacted, at least in the voting in a lot of these states. And I mean, it's pretty. Bernie Sanders is we don't have any delusions about Bernie Sanders. We've shared our criticisms of him on a number of occasions and will continue to do so. But I mean, I think it's pretty, I don't know what to make of like this, in a lot of ways, a very large scale, rejection of Sanders for someone like Joe Biden. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and I think we're democracy at some level is on the decline. No matter what the sort of the reactionary resistance or the Democratic establishment want to tell you, that this was just sort of the Democratic voters just coming to the wise choice, uniting choice. Obviously, there's lots of establishment, quote unquote, shenanigans around the timing of the dropping out of the
That was
of
very important, by the way. And Elizabeth Warren not endorsing Bernie, also, she's still holding out on that. I mean, that's another thing right there. I mean, she didn't come out and endorse Biden, but she has held out long enough that it really has hurt him. So,
Yeah, I think we underestimated how the level of unwisdom or absurdity clinging to a certain real stale form of power that the networks that control the Democratic Party would actually be in terms of standing up Joe Biden, sort of like a weekend at Biden's kind of scenario, walking him around. It's which sort of angry scene, sort of old guy dealing with some kind of like mental issues, ruptures, senility, dementia do you want, right? So when it came down to Michael Bloomberg versus Trump, it was like which you know Zionist quote unquote billionaire with obvious aggression issues towards women do you want, and then when it comes down to Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, it's which old guy with struggling with the organic components of their brain do you want to choose here? And of course you're going to have the mainstream Democrats trying to say, oh, that's just Russian propaganda, the same Russian propaganda that tried to, point out that Hillary Clinton had health problems and stuff like that. But, facts are facts. That's why there's sort of the deal with the virus. There's going to be certain biological realities that are becoming very apparent with someone like Joe Biden and from
yeah.
his gaffes. But what's interesting about it is that like the way that he acted towards that auto worker who was actually asking a Second Amendment question in a very fair and I think wise kind of way, no matter whether you agree with it or not. He was doing it fair, and what he basically said, Joe Biden started shoving his finger in the guy's face, and the guy said, "This is not okay." and you would think that like in the era of Me Too and the understanding of the way that that kind of sort of like hyper aggressive, sort of toxic fake masculinity, and it is fake because it's Joe Biden overcompensating for his sense of frailness around his mind and his policies and his background in terms of the sort of deceptive defenses of his votes for the Iraq War and all of that. And that comes out as a sort of a very aggressive finger pointing in people's space in an age of a global pandemic. And this guy just basically didn't yell at him. The auto
Yeah.
worker basically said, "This is not okay. What's the deal? Handguns kill more people than what you call assault rifles, AR-14, as
Hmm.
Biden said." And it was a fair political point, and Biden couldn't even stand it. And he was like shush shush to his might have even been Simone Sanders.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I mean,
Biden's going to take his AR-14 to the senatorial campaign rally on Super Thursday.
so this is an utter breakdown. And then just last point in terms of the what I would call the democracy on the decline in all of this is that the Bernie Sanders people and crew were no position to actually deal with what is the reality of what actually happened in terms of the actual functions of democracy in terms of voting, which I've pointed out before over and over, are just the very they're not even the key piece of democracy. Serious conversation is the key of democracy, but then voting is then another layer to it. And we don't even know the mechanics behind it. The exit polls are all off again. People say, "Oh, that's just exit polling." But meanwhile, around the world, if the exit polls were off that much, then the U.S. Congress would be weaponizing it in other countries around the world. And then we also saw massive voter suppression in terms of lines and lines and lines, like hours long. In LA County, their new voter database, digital database, was inaccessible for many hours. Similar kinds of things happened all around the country. And, people, working people, students, people who really don't have the time to be standing in line for hours and hours and hours to place a vote, did that. And many of them were not able to continue standing in line. So there was a massive suppression of turnout while also these questions linger in the air. And I have no faith that Bernie Sanders and his people are going to get to the bottom of it, of election fraud. Have you ever
Absolutely
heard Bernie
not.
Sanders
And
say that phrase, election fraud? No.
no, and it's, he's still talking about Joe Biden as his friend and telling people at his rallies not to boo Biden. He's a friend of mine. He's a good man. Obama and Biden and these are good people. I'm going to do whatever I can to support the candidate. And, if it's not me. And meanwhile, it's a pretty sad state of affairs when Donald Trump's Twitter account and Fox News has more to say about the obvious anti-Bernie activities and tactics, what is obviously this very obvious anti-Bernie Sanders campaign going on within the Democratic Party in 2000, obviously in 2016, and even now in 2020. I mean, when your rivals are more outspoken about it than you are, I mean, that's just not a good sign at all. And I mean, it's once again, I mean, I think our friend Chris Rulon back in May of 2015, when he tweeted on when he Bernie Sanders is the sheepdog who's going to give the nomination to Clinton and stand down to her. I mean, it's serving more and more prophetic, not only in 2016 but again in 2020. And if it's gotten to this point, it's not gonna change at this point. I mean, this is not somebody who's going to stand up and fight whatever his motivations are, and it's pretty sad to see play out.
Yeah, well, if is Bernie going to have another chance at this in 2024 when he's 82 or whatever? I mean, so I don't know. So the once again, similarly to the question of the global pandemic, when you have quote unquote leadership that is more interested in their numbers or their sort of the purity of a specific sort of limited policy analysis if it's sort of coming through people like Bernie Sanders, um, or this sort of just pure narcissism, immoral narcissism of someone like Trump. We the people are a little bit on our own, except for the fact that there are still reasonable and rational people with some bit of courage at certain layers in our government, in especially in more local areas. And so a lot of the question about how we're going to handle both this democracy question, and what's interesting, and more you're beginning to see this question of a hand counted paper ballot as the proper solution to all of our woes around the question of election security, defending digital democracy, the threat of the Russians, the threat of the Israelis, the threat of the domestic black ops coming out of the networks of the CNP, for example, right? So whether, no matter what that question is, in terms of defending our democracy, more and more, even into the mainstream media, are beginning to see the obvious logical conclusion that sort of simple things such as using paper to cast a vote and then using humans to count it is the way to go about it. And so more and more, a lot of these solutions are going to come from we the people on up. And that does not mean that it's sort of not through some of our governments, and especially our local governments. And it's a time to be even more involved than ever, even while we might be desiring to, or effectively self isolating ourselves physically in the midst of this. So the discourse becomes even more important in a day and age when conferences and even potentially political conventions get shut down. So that's what we seek to foster here at the Antidote, is a vigorous discussion of reality as we can best ascertain it.
Yeah, yeah, and so we'll keep eyes out on these topics and hope to have a bigger conversation on all this. And it's just, I think it's important to, on one hand, be realistic about these scenarios, but also not to get too, really not. I don't think being too alarmist about this stuff is the way to go either. Although, you did mention we're in the third month of 2020 right now, and so far we've had like, the Soleimani assassination sparking off fears of a World War III. Now we've got what it seems to be a global major epidemic that is going to really come to America, and I think really in major ways affect us domestically. And then we've still got the uncertainty of a major political season coming up. So only being not even 2.5 months into the year 2020 yet. I mean, what is, we can't begin to think about, imagine what our world's going to look like on January 1st, 2021. But I think it's important to try to keep a level head, try to stay realistic about things as possible, and not get overly alarmist. Or I think there is an element that wants to play off of a hysteria of people, but you don't want to get into that. But at the same time, we've got to remain realistic and try to look at these things, I think, in as realistic of a manner as we possibly can. And we hope we can help people do that, being as imperfect as we are. Hopefully we can help steer a conversation like that in some ways.
I completely agree. And then, so in our last minute here, uh, I do think that that is a very, very crucial piece, is to figure out not only that balance between biological defense and the economy, because all of that's going to need to be rethought, and we're going to have to rethink it on the fly. We're going to have to think about how we recreate actual domestic manufacturing of the key, especially of our key items that we need, but also about how we think about our biological security. And in the midst of all of that, the conversation becomes a crucial factor in balancing how we do not become alarmists while also not being ostriches with our heads in the sand. And in that radical middle is the proper massive action that's based on a wise allocation of our attention towards the important things that make us Americans and that make us humans. All right, till next week. Antidote, we out.
All right, thank you very much. Till next time.